Whether they lead with a roar or quietly go about their business on the pitch, captains play a vital role in sport, don't they? And in terms of working with you as a head coach, Gary, how important is choosing the right type of leader to help you do your job?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Dave, isn't it? But you hear so much debate nowadays on, is the captain's role dying out? Are those type of players around anymore? And of course, I don't think any of that is necessarily true. I think people just evolve. Players evolve. The type of player that you work with evolves. That the type of manager, you can argue that the type of manager that would have had a captain that was a shouter and an organizer and the manager on the pitch. How many managers are left like that? So I think everything moves along and everything sort of mimics the way that football and society goes. So I think it's still vastly important. I think it's changed in my mind in terms of what you want as a manager. Now, of course, you want somebody who's your eyes and ears on the pitch. Of course, you don't just want one person, but mainly there's one person wearing the armband. So you want that one person to certainly extol the virtues and the values and the standards every day in training and on the pitch that you like your team to have, whatever that may be. And also, I think the biggest change for me is I found that having a captain on the pitch who knows tactically what you want and knows tactically how to action some of those changes within the games and organise that with the rest of the players is just as important as someone who is authoritative and someone who shouts and screams and commands respect from the players in that sense. That's my alarm. I'm not sure what that was for. That was how long I had to answer that question, Dave. I'm sorry.
But you bring up a great point there, that the modern captain is expected to carry out many, many roles, aren't they? They have the ceremonial things that they have to do, like wear the armband, lead the team out the tunnel, do the coin toss, and so on. But actually, their influence on the pitch, yes, is not just as a motivator, but it is now as a tactical conduit between yourself and him and the team on the pitch.
Yeah, it's so difficult, I think, in game. I mean, obviously, you want your team to be coached in a way that they're flexible in game, that they know what changes to make. We've spoke about it previously where we've worked on two or three different formations and we've worked on lots of different scenarios. We did the sort of training sessions in the last few jobs around we're 1-0 down. We're playing this way. How do we change? And allowing players to make some of those decisions around the structure that you want within the game. And sometimes you don't want three or four players making that decision. You want one player that you trust implicitly and knows how you work. And sometimes you have captains where you've had a relationship with them along the way. A lot of managers will sign previous captains because they know how they work and they trust them. I think you can walk into a club and find that person within days. Within days of chatting. We did that at, let's say, for example, Millwall, when we had Alex Pearce, and Pearcey was the natural leader in the dressing room. The players, if you'd have said to the players, if you'd have given the captain's armband to another player, the other players would have said, well, no, Pearcey's the captain. They wouldn't have been comfortable with it. Such was his sort of standing in the dressing room for different reasons. And if I go back to someone like that, not only was he that conduit, like you said, tactically on the pitch, he was also the person that helped drive standards. He was also the person that you could go to and say, Pearcey, do me a favour. Can you sort that out? And he would sort it out. Other roles that we'll probably come on to later where, captains can have their own imprint on what they think leadership looks like, not just how the manager wants it to look. At Millwall, they all had jobs. They all had a way of building and being a part of the culture. Interestingly enough, I asked Pearcey about that and he didn't actually know why he did it. It was just something it's interesting.
Very organic.
But it was just something that he sort of organic and he stumbled across that, okay, I'll tell the story. So we walked in, didn't we? And every player had a role, whether it was getting the staff shower gel for away games, whether it was making sure someone was on the bus on time. What other roles did he have? Because you would have known some of those jobs. What are some of those jobs? Don't go into some of the more detailed and specific roles, Dave. But
Yeah, but he had roles around functions, say. So somebody had to know about the next number of games, away games, where we were playing and where we were staying. Somebody else was responsible for knowing what the menu was on the day. Other players were involved in more kind of disciplinary items, So whether it was somebody who was in charge of the fine money and making sure it was collected, you had other people who were almost the enforcers of the fines, going around actually debt collecting from their teammates. And then you had others who were kind of, cultural roles, So I think it was Ryan Leonard who was designated as, I think, Mr. Negative. So he was there to make sure that players didn't run away with themselves when times were good. He kept the kind of the spirit level, kind of, don't get too high. And then you had other players who were more responsible for, games and social side to make sure that spirits were kept high at the right time. So it was really interesting. It was almost like a military type of leadership, wasn't it? Where he found out that keeping people busy and giving them roles and jobs to do meant that everybody had to contribute to the group. You couldn't be a passenger in that dressing room, could you?
no, and also I think if you look at psychology of a team and being part of a team, but the more valued and the more of a role that you have to play in building that culture yourself as a player, as an individual, the more likely you are to persist when things are not going well. The more likely you are to push that culture and help shape that culture in difficult times. So I think it was brilliant, and so that's just a good example of how a captain can offer so much more than just on the pitch, of how captaincy has probably evolved over the years from being someone who just automatically stood out on the pitch in a, often the captain would be the one at the end of the game. I'm going over the top here, but his head would be bandaged up. There'd be Terry Butcher style blood on him. He'd still be organising and cajoling the players, and there was that type of leadership, that never say die, put your body on the line, put everyone else before yourself type of leadership. But then there's other types of leadership, and I think certainly some of those other ways have evolved over the years into something equally as important.
Yeah, certainly one of your archetypal leader like Terry Butcher was probably like a Steve Bruce or maybe a Roy Keane at Manchester United at that time. They almost had multiple leaders on the pitch and multiple captains. So you may have had one person who, yes, had the armband, but that didn't mean that other players didn't extol those kind of leadership virtues and almost became unit leaders, whether it was in defense or in attack or in midfield. But obviously you had to have one person who wore the armband, but it doesn't mean that other players in the team don't extol those kind of captain virtues, do they?
No, and also I think sometimes you obviously you tend to have, and everyone does it. I think you tend to have a leadership group. Some people would have it where they'd have five or six of the senior players. We've done it before where you actually want representation from different parts of the group. You certainly want a young player in there to give an opinion of how the young players feel at certain parts of the season.
Yeah.
We've had young players who you look at them, and certainly as a manager, I felt that player's got leadership qualities, and you try and help them. You help nurture those qualities, and you help bring those out. You've seen other people. I've seen the captain picked in so many different ways. I've seen it picked on a player that you want to, not me personally, but a player you want to keep at the club. I've had players that we've tried to keep at the club, and someone within the club, let's say the director of football or the chief exec, said, "Oh, would you consider giving him the captaincy role so that he, it helps him want to stay?" Or you've signed a player. I've heard clubs sign players, give them the captain's armband to sort of, to sell that role because they've been desperate. And actually, sometimes that person hasn't been the right person for the role. So I think it really should be based on, in certain ways, the players probably should have a big say in who is their leader. Within the dressing room, I think that's important. And of course, the manager has to have somebody he feels is the right person, also. For the reasons that we've spoke about.
Yeah, and as you say there, sometimes those leaders, as they get picked, and or you walk in and they've already been picked, and sometimes they are the right leader for you, aren't they? They are the right captain that you would maybe naturally go to. But sometimes, and this is obviously a major decision for a new manager coming in, is actually finding the captain that they want, somebody who maybe matches with their style of leadership and management, who can then reflect how the manager wants to work inside that dressing room, because it's not always on the pitch, is it? Like the work that goes on a lot of the time around ensuring that the dressing room is run correctly, that training and all the kind of organization around how the team functions does come down to what happens in that dressing room. And the captain obviously should lead that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Dressing rooms are different up and down the country. I think that's important, isn't it? There'd be 92 dressing rooms in professional football in this country, and every one of them will be slightly different. Every one of them will have a slightly different makeup. Every one of them will have different nationalities, different cultures, different views, different ambitions amongst the players. And I think the important bit as a manager, you try to create that culture of togetherness, that culture of you're all fighting for the same goal and you're all pushing in the same direction to achieve what you're trying to achieve, and galvanizing that, and isn't just as easy as we know of picking a captain and hoping the captain can action that within the dressing room. You have to, every single day you have to try and nurture that and work to help develop it. I've had captains before. I've had captains that I've signed, but we've already had a captain at the club, and it's been really, really difficult because that other person's coming in. He's a natural leader. I remember when I was at Burton, I signed John Massinio. I had Ian Sharps at the time, who was actually quite a quiet leader in some ways, but he was a very effective leader of the team. And John Massinio came in, and straight away you could just tell he was a perfect captain. And thankfully those two players were intelligent enough to go about not undermining each other, to go about adding value in their own different ways. But I've seen it before where players come in and sometimes actually there's that little power struggle and that power challenge between a player coming in who wants a captaincy role, within the dressing room, and someone who's hanging on to that role, who's maybe a little bit older on the way out. So it is such a fragile dynamic. I think sometimes you have to make those decisions for the betterment of the group.
Yeah.
Sometimes you make those decisions and it actually hinders the group. I think sometimes when you've held on to those decisions and tried to wait and not undermine the captain at the time, sometimes other players have almost come to you and said, "Look, Gaffer, we know that so and so's the captain. Really, why don't you just give it to him? It's fine." And it's a really difficult balance, is it? It's really difficult nuance. I mean, you must have had that, Dave, off the pitch at times in the gym, and different players sort of jostling for position. Like you've probably got these sort of two alpha male type of characters who, you're looking at it going, "Oh, this could be a little bit awkward. How do I manage this?"
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? When you start to look at the dressing room, start to almost line up in factions behind their guy, and it can be a difficult situation when you know that there are potentially two suitors for the role, or even three. I remember at Norwich, we had essentially three captains at the same time. There was the one who was, as you know, it's another role, which is the club captain. And then there was like the team captain. And that might have changed. And then we had one player who was almost outstanding by example, probably the best player at the time in his position, probably recognized across the league in his position as being outstanding. But he wasn't potentially the natural choice. Everybody on the outside would have said that's the captain. But within the organization, you value those players that are going to be, uh, highly graded player every game. They're going to get an 8 or a 9 out of 10 potentially every game, and that's a player who's going to be on the team sheet every week. And sometimes that actually plays into your thinking, doesn't it? You know, you want to pick a player who's going to be comfortable almost in knowing he's going to be picked every week and therefore can take on that role of being the leader on the pitch, as opposed to sometimes what we see at the other end, which is the aging player who's now fighting for his place but still holding on to the armband. And is it the fact that they've got the armband that's almost keeping them still on the pitch when potentially better or younger players who could take their position are being held off just because the armband is really keeping that player still in that role?
Yeah, I think you've made a couple of great points there. But if you look at the captain or the leader that leads by example, it's a very different role, isn't it? That's someone who trains brilliantly every day, regardless of the situation. Someone that you lose a game, and on the Monday morning, he's the first one in, he's the first one working, he does everything right. And actually, that example can be so powerful for a club within the academy, with young players coming into the first team, with players that are probably, haven't got that mindset. Sometimes that person can drag 4 or 5 other players with them, within those little cliques that we see in clubs, within those little groups. So I think that's an absolutely vital part of leadership. Even if you haven't got the captain's armband, like you've said before, you can still be a leader and still play a role, and there's different ways to do it. I think it's always difficult. What do you value on the pitch? When we look at good teams have a balance, don't they? Good teams have, fabulous technical players, great athleticism, a balance of different skills and different technicalities within the team. Most good teams have, you know, brilliant wingers 1v1, but they also have, that single pivot quarterback type of player that dictates the game, that hasn't got those qualities but has different qualities and knits it all together. I think a captain and characters are exactly the same. When you pick a team, you don't. This is why I think it's really interesting. We spoke about data recently, but data doesn't necessarily measure mental resilience on a pitch. It doesn't necessarily measure decision making. It doesn't necessarily measure motivation and the way that other players can motivate their team in bad moments of games. And so those factors are equally as important and equally as vital to the lifeblood of a good team. So I think when you pick a team, you have that in mind. You have it in mind that there's going to be parts of the game where you might need that type of role in your team. I think the challenge becomes, and we've all seen it, where that player just starts to diminish his performance, and you have to make that decision. I want the leadership in there, but at the moment they don't warrant their place on the team, or they don't. You can't see the team move. Sometimes you get it at the end of the season, don't you? We think, what, to move forward as a team, we just need to go maybe a little bit younger and a slightly different profile. And occasionally that's backfired. Occasionally that's worked. I've always tried to keep those people around. I think those people are vital for a club. They're vital for a
Yes.
culture. I've had conversations with owners where they haven't understood why you want to keep a player, maybe that is earning still 2, 3, 4,000 pounds a week, but his role essentially is, helping create the culture and not on the pitch. They would just see that as a waste of value. Whereas as a manager, you see it as incredible value just because you know what they bring off the pitch. So yeah, it's a really difficult balance, I think.
So let's go back to a point you made earlier about leadership groups, because that's something that's probably become a little bit more common nowadays, isn't it? Where you actually have gone away from the manager and the captain and they just talk alone, where a lot of decisions now involve the leadership group from the dressing room. And it's certainly something that we've seen in like the AFL or the NFL, where there are almost multiple captains. And then they will come and sit with you as the head coach, manager, and sit in a room, and whatever the issues that might need to be spoken about are spoken about among a group of people. How's that started to influence how you as a head coach and manager would then work with that leadership group. Does that mean we move away from more of a kind of group based captaincy, and then there's just somebody who does the ceremonial things, or does that mean you still need to have one guy who's going to be, the alpha, as you called it before?
I think you still need that one guy because there's only one person with the armband, and of course you want to help create more people that can add value on the pitch in that same way. I think it all comes down to, if you look, if you look in any business, football's no different, sports no different, and often sport plagiarizes, if you like, learns from the way that business works and the way that that team dynamic works. And I think if you look back sort of a number of years, I remember reading a lot on, team dynamics, and it was all about giving the players, there was a spell where it was going away from that autocratic style of management and coaching, and giving a lot more autonomy to players, a lot more of the role to the team to help shape the culture and some of the decisions going forward. Of course, as a head coach, you still have to manage that and make sure that's guided along in the way that you think is the right thing. But you have to listen and you have to give them that autonomy. I think the challenge, and I've found the challenge, is when you try to do that sometimes to 25 players. Let's take a review meeting after a game. When you start to put that out to 25 players, in the end, if you're not careful, we've seen it where players then feel like they have to have an opinion just because you're asking them. And that's great, but sometimes you can end up with an hour of conversation, and often it will digress away completely from where you need it to be or where the team needs it to be. So I think it's a lot easier sometimes to just streamline that down into maybe heads of units, or leaders, or one person from each demographic within the team, because then of course you're talking to 5 or 6 people, and they get more of a say on a regular basis, and you get to
Yeah.
build a relationship with those players. I think that's probably how most of that's come about. That's not to say you don't still have big group settings, but I think sometimes it's hard to be focused in those meetings as opposed to maybe 5 or 6. So I think it's definitely. I think when you look at American sports, there's definitely a lot of things that are different. I mean, we tried to do it in a coaching sense, didn't we? In one of the clubs where we had unit coaches, and we tried to bring in unit coaches to see if we can sort of almost mirror the way that's going. I think that's the same with players. Do you have unit leaders? Do you have a leader of the back four? Do you have a, a spokesman for the younger players? How do you do it? I think that's down to you as a manager or a head coach or a head of performance, or however you see fit. But I think regular time, regular contact has a massive benefit, allowing players to, have their opinion on multiple facets of the culture and the team. Listening to players, I would always say it going into a group, but there's one head coach. There's often 25 players. The players are experts as well. They've been playing football since a very, very young age. You can learn an awful lot off the players. Not all of them. We won't go into names. We're not all of them.
Definitely not all
The
of them.
off the
Yeah.
pitch is not all of them. But therefore, so I think this style of leadership definitely will evolve. You'll get clubs with more. I hear some clubs, they'll change the leadership role over. I'm not sure about that one personally. I think that then becomes a little bit tokenism, where you're just giving it so it makes someone feel important for one game. But can that person actually fulfill that role? And I think there's routes it'll go down. There's routes I don't think necessarily work, but that's for every club and every head coach to make that decision.
Yeah, and sometimes that is a case of, if the person who wears the armband on a Saturday is, being given the opportunity, especially if you're trying to, if you've got multiple leaders in the room and you're trying to figure out which one might actually perform that the best, that maybe that cycling of that armband is important for the head coach to figure out, well, which is the guy who's going to be able to take this forward and actually lead the team on the pitch. But of course, you're also balancing all those bits around the team and around the kind of Saturday or the match day, where they also have to perform other things like how do they mentor the young players coming through? Because quite often for the younger players coming through, they're looking up at the leader, the captain, to be that role model for them, aren't they? You know, in terms of professionalism, in terms of organization, in terms of being able to communicate and how they address certain situations. So, I mean, that's certainly one of the aspects that we've talked about in the past, haven't we? You also need to trust that leader. Whether they're the best player or not, they need to be trustworthy for the coaching staff to know that the captain almost has to have your back as well, don't they?
Yeah, just as you're talking, it made me think about the young players, and actually, I think that whilst you wouldn't want to rotate the captain in a first team environment, in my opinion, but in a youth environment, I think that would be a really, really good way of doing things. If you think about all the youth teams, if you think about the under 23s, even, having a different I mean, I suppose certainly at younger ages, having a different captain in each game allows you to see how that player responds. It allows you to see if you can find that unlikely leader, or allow it to see whether that young player maybe has some of those qualities, or use it as a tool to help bring some of those qualities out. So I think that's important. I think, look, I think every culture, every successful culture, in my opinion, to a point, has people that understand the culture. If it's successful, understand what a good culture. Let's take somewhere like the All Blacks. Of course, you know, I won't say your sport, Dave, because I'm sure that football has vastly become your sport. But but
Obviously, yeah.
but rugby, one of your great passions, of course. And if you look at the All Blacks, that would have been passed down. That culture would have been passed down from senior players to younger players in such a effective way. Of course, it's easier sometimes, I feel, at an international level, because that's what everyone aspires to. People don't do that for the money. They don't necessarily do that for the fame. They do that to wear that black shirt, on that occasion. So I suppose it's an easier culture to build up this mythical shirt, and what you've got to do. I suppose most young players coming into that would just do what they're told to do, but nevertheless, it's a really important part those senior players, or those players with a shirt, have got. And I think that's the same in a football club. It's so important that when those young players come up into the first team, or even, I've read about the Spain national team, when they all go away and camp, the Spanish national team, the seniors will sit with the younger players at dinner. And that may be something England can learn from, but the senior players will go out and watch the younger players train. They are a team. They are a one club, one nation mentality. And what that helps achieve, I'm sort of digressing, but it's the same point. What it helps achieve is this idea of, these are the things you need to do. And that has to surely inspire a young player to want to fulfill that idea of what it is to be a player at that club.
Yeah, the alignment between the culture of the team and the people in the team. We obviously know of the famous "no dickheads" policy that the All Blacks have spoken about. You know
We
that
had that on
people
a sign.
coming.
Dave, we had that on a sign, didn't we? And we got told to take it down because tours around the training ground, or around young kids on. So
Yeah.
we had to bow to better judgment. But yeah, it's a very striking sign. Sorry.
Yeah, but I suppose those kind of sentiments, which is, what you come into, the culture is often generated from the dressing room and it's developed by those leaders. You spoke about it earlier with Alex Pearson, how he went about it. And obviously, the All Blacks are a very famous now version of that. And some of the clubs that feed into the All Blacks have developed that. The Canterbury Crusaders have this unbelievable uh, legacy of captains who have gone on to be All Black captains. It's almost developed further down the line, those leadership skills, the captaincy roles that people take on. And therefore, when you become an All Black captain, or in the past you were a Manchester United or a Liverpool captain, or whatever the great captains in sport that we've seen, somewhere they've been influenced. Somebody's nurtured those skills. Now, whether it's innate in people or it's been developed in the environments, the one thing we can be damn sure of is when you see a great captain, they stick out a mile from the rest of the group, don't they?
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be at a club or in a culture where there's a leader that just does everything. And actually, sometimes you sit back and actually admire that person, and often that player. Sometimes when you get those roles, you know that other people will be looking, thinking he's the sort of player we want within our culture and within our club. And I think you have to try and treasure those players that because you get different players, don't you? You get you'll get the number. I'm not saying you have to be one or the other, but you'll get the number nine who thinks maybe a bit more selfishly, who every club wants that 20 plus goal scorer every season. But often some of those players are very individual, not all of them, but very individual in their thinking. You'll get you'll get tricky wingers that are maybe a little bit in and out, but I'm sort of generalising, of course, here and stereotyping to a certain degree that sometimes that free winger will be maybe someone you've got to manage a little bit differently, and then certain roles seem to bring up certain types of players, don't they? If you look at a lot of the captains over the years, they've been probably defenders or midfielders on the whole, haven't they? I would say predominantly, if you look at the roles, because maybe they have to be a little bit more unselfish in the way that they play. Maybe they have to get used to doing a lot of the work that maybe people don't see. So they're perhaps happier to do that sort of work and that sort of role where it's less about them and it's more about the team and the group cohesion. I don't know, but it'd be interesting to do. Obviously, we haven't got time right now, unless you're really, really quick on the internet. But to do a study of where the majority of captains would come from, um, as in positionally, and I would imagine it would follow the trend that I've spoke about. But it's when you find one, to build that relationship. I've had some brilliant relationships with captains along the way. People like I said, people like John Mousinho, people like Curtis Davis at Derby, Robbo at Birmingham, Michael Morrison at Birmingham, Piercy, Hutchie. So different players that fit that role, and they're all a little bit different. They're all a little bit different in the way they could go about it, and I would say on every single one of those players and those different types of captains, I probably learned a number of things, as a manager. They make you a better manager because they also will challenge how you think and how you work. Hopefully not too much, but a little bit.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned there, like obviously, if you look at all of those captains, I think one thing that stands out, we worked with them for many years, is when the chips were down, when you were in a tough situation or pressure was building, or there was a flex point where you needed something to come through, those guys were really good at handling pressure. They were really good at dealing with sometimes the negative moments. And a lot of people are really good captains when everything's positive, isn't it? Because it's plain sailing. There's no ripples on the water, going back to a water theme. But these guys were all fantastic when it came to tough decisions. When they had to handle pressure, they were able to step forward and take it on their shoulders and keep the team moving forward. And that's such a help when we're trying to, do a gym session and some of the lads' heads have gone, but we need the group to get in there and do the work. The work doesn't stop. We might be in a bad moment, but we need to keep doing the work, because when the good times come back, or certainly the work we're doing will bring the good times back. And that's where we need those guys to be able to, get the troops out of the trenches and moving forward.
Yeah. Firstly, I'm trying to work out why they would have had a head loss in the gym session, Dave. Was it that bad, or what was going on there? Was it just
Well,
you're
yeah,
pushing them
just
to higher levels as usual?
that's it.
Some of them don't
Yeah.
want to go there, do they? Taking people to places where they're not comfortable.
Well,
Is
we
yeah.
know in those situations when it gets a bit negative, nobody wants to be there, do they? It's kind of get into the training ground, train, and get home again. And people stop doing all the good things that we should be doing, or at least some of them try and do that. What's the point in doing this? And that's where your captain can get hold of the group and say, we don't stop doing what's right just because results aren't going our way. We keep doing what's right.
Yeah, and it goes back to, what sort of qualities do you want from a captain? I think we spoke about this before in terms of staff members, certainly department leaders, but sometimes you can't be popular. You can't always be popular, rather, or popularity is a side effect of doing the right things, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Is a respect. It's not popular just because you're really funny, like obviously the likes of us two are. Do you know what I mean? There's many different attributes you need, but I think that if you look at lead, when do you find out most about people certainly in football, in our experience, if you're not going for a good patch, that is when the true characters stand up, and sometimes they come from the most unlikely of places as well. It's not just your captain, and that's when you learn a lot about people. We've seen a lot of players when it's not going well, all hunkering down in their little groups, and it's like anything, isn't it? Players do it, staff do it, we all do it, where everyone whinges about things that are not really important when you're not winning. But what you do need sometimes is you need those players who are going to try and stamp their authority down on the rest of the group as well. And actually, that can be so much more powerful coming from a player than it does coming from a manager or a head coach at times, or a member of the coaching staff, because there's only so many times you can, shout at players, stop the session, demand better standards, question whether the players want to do that for themselves, because again, it has to come from them. Often, if a player can do that, if you can get two or three players in the group that can push that, that saves you having to do it. And also, there's also times where, a captain's come to me and said, Gaffer, listen, everything's high pressured at the moment. They might not say it in this way, but what they're really probably saying is you're getting too stressed out. You're being too harsh on the players. You're being too demanding. Maybe what we need is something to lighten the load. Maybe we need a down day, or maybe we need to take the players and their families out for some food and just try and get back to that culture of togetherness in a different way, relax people in a different way. And actually, occasionally a captain will come up with one of those ideas where you go, actually, he's probably right. Sometimes you're too far in the thick of it to see to see that sort of chink of light, and often a player will come up with a solution to a problem, and that's exactly what you want them to do. I think that's how it. I think that's how any culture should be. If you're a player, you should be part of that process. You should be a big part of the process. You should be able to help shape that process if you think you've got something valuable to add. That's what good cultures do. And if you're a manager, you have to listen to that. You can't just think that you know everything. You have to listen to your leaders in the team. You have to listen to the players, and I think that leadership role, that captaincy role, is absolutely a vital part of that.
Just finally, yeah, it's the often the transition has been in the past that captains then go on to be managers. We look back over the history of great managers in football and even in other sports, and they were captains, leaders. But maybe we're now seeing, with on a slight pivot, the rise of a different type of head coach nowadays, who may not necessarily have played the game and may not necessarily have been in one of those roles. Maybe the more analytical player who was quietly, tactically understanding the game more, but they weren't necessarily a tub thumper at the front, rah, 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 and leading the team out the tunnel. Do you think there's still going to be that opportunity for those guys who were those leaders of men or leaders of people to still be able to go into those roles where it's maybe less technical and it's more cultural and more about group dynamics and that type of leadership? Or is the game going to pivot now where those natural transitions for captains to become head coaches is going to be more challenging?
No, I think there's always room for different characters and different ways of doing things. I don't think there's ever one way of doing it. I think we're so fixated in football, aren't we? Sometimes where one person comes along and plays a certain way that then to be successful, everybody has to do that. And actually, sometimes you don't get room for that authenticity or that variety in the way the game's shaped and played. I think that, captains come in different forms, which we spoke about at the start of the podcast. And I think managers and head coaches come in different forms. If you look at the moment of, three of let's say last season the three top managers or three of the top managers around Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp, Carlo Ancelotti. If you look at those three, they all manage in. Of course, I haven't worked under them, unfortunately, but from what I can read and what I can understand, they all work in very different ways. They're all analytical. They all understand the game, but perhaps Ancelotti doesn't coach as much. But the way he manages and makes the players feel, is enough to win them the Champions League in seasons gone by. Do you know what I mean? So that level is still the highest level you can get, and I know they've got great players. Klopp, I think, is a blend between Guardiola and Ancelotti in some ways, where his human qualities seem to stand out, but of course he still has an analytical eye, on the training ground. And look, Guardiola will have all of those things, but he's lauded as the best coach around tactically. So
Yes.
I think you'll always get different types of players become different types of head coaches. There's no doubt now that a head coach role has been shaped slightly differently. We spoke about that with sporting directors, with the way that clubs are building their own cultures within clubs for the long term. And I think there's going to be an effect on that. You don't need someone who's a specific type of leader anymore. You need someone who's got a multitude of qualities and characteristics in order to achieve the role. So yeah, I think that's the beauty of football, isn't it? The beauty of football for me is there's so much difference and there's so many different ways of doing things, and actually that makes for great games, and that makes for great characters, and that makes for great performances and great achievements, which is why we love the game so much.
Yeah, well, we could go on about captains for so long. It would be fascinating to give you a list of managers and managers, list of captains, and say which ones you probably would have liked to play under, or maybe liked to have managed. So I'm kind of thinking along the Patrick Vieira versus a Roy Keane, or a Steve Bruce versus, I don't know, like a Messi who's just quietly goes about his game and is super influential, but a Roy Keane who's going to grab the shirt of somebody else. But maybe we'll leave that for another day, for another
Whistle,
feature.
whistleblowers. It could be Dave from Norwich has a question. That's the thing. And the answer, Dave, to that one before you even ask it, anonymously, is Messi. I'm going to go for Messi or Ronaldo. I've always liked those qualities within those players. Of course, I have. So yeah,
Spoiler.
happy to accommodate them in any team that I have soon.
Fascinating. Yeah, captain and all around great guys as well. There you are. Okay, until the next time. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, Dave.